Good afternoon and welcome back here at the Global Solutions Summit 2023 in Berlin. As you've heard, my name is Sebastian Schwark. I'm a partner at Fleischmann-Hillard, the strategic communications firm. I'll be the moderator today. The topic is promoting social well-being in times of transformation and uncertainty. And I'm very pleased that we have Gala Diaz-Langu, the executive director of CPAC, a not-for-profit organization in Buenos Aires here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Irene Navidad, the president of Globe Women Research and Education Institute, also non-for-profit in Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
And Sanjeev Krishan, the chairperson of PwC in India. Welcome. And online we have Achim Steiner. There you are. Hi. The administrator of the United Nations Development Program, and Marc Fleurbet, a professor at the Paris School of Economics. Hello. So this is a hybrid session. We have 45 minutes to discuss the topic, how we can promote social well-being in times of transformation. So that's not a lot of time. I'd like to dive right into it. With our topic today, we're at the heart of what the Global Solutions Summit is all about. We need to recouple economic prosperity with social progress and environmental sustainability. But in the past 15 years, we have seen crisis after crisis. From the global financial crisis in 2008 to the euro crisis, the global pandemic, more recently, the energy crunch that we're seeing, the inflation crisis that we're seeing right now. And then if we look forward, we see a climate crisis, we see political polarization to an extent that we haven't seen since 1989. We see that many democracies are in crisis. Some are shifting to authoritarianism, and we see the transformational effect of digital technology, which is affecting all of us and kind of converging the physical and the digital worlds. We also see unimaginable wealth in the hand of a few, while progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals seems to be lagging. And to understand this polycrisis, we want to see how it affects social well-being and what we can do about it. I would like to start with you, Gala. Thank you for being here. You're based in Argentina, so you had a long way to come. Thank you for making the journey. Your country was 100 years ago maybe one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and since then it has seen many crises, and now it seems to be more recently in economic recession. From your perspective, what are the main challenges in this transformation that we're going through for the well-being of individuals and communities?
Well, thank you, Sebastian, for the question. It's a pleasure to be here. The current crisis in Argentina has economic, political, and institutional and environmental, social features to it. It's a very concrete example of a polycrisis. But every single aspect of this crisis has in common a factor of mistrust. There's a huge interpersonal mistrust, which has dropped to historical levels, interpersonal trust. But I think most worryingly, we have also hit a record in terms of low institutional trust. The average trust in institutions worldwide is around 50%. In Argentina, 17% of people trust institutions. Public, private companies, universities, whatever. Obviously, the situation with high mistrust and high uncertainty isn't a very fertile situation to think about how can we get out of this polycrisis, because often uncertainty leads us to stillness. We're afraid to get the projections wrong. We're afraid to assume high costs today for future benefits that we don't know. A, whether we will be seeing them concretely, and B, whether we will be able to benefit from them. So this often leads us to immobility and to maintenance of status quo, which is the non-resolution of the most structural problems that we have, and therefore how we keep falling into this succession of crises that you've mentioned. Obviously, in this context, it's difficult, but what we think should be done is to think about the future, even amidst this sea of uncertainties that we have in Argentina and also globally. We do have some certainties. We know that climate crisis won't go away. We know that population will keep aging. We know digitalization won't go away. We know that income will keep on concentrating probably in fewer hands, etc. And we can maybe think about how this will implicate the public sphere mostly and make projections and take action. Because what we should realize is that status quo is very costly, even considering these trends. Because if we don't do it, we'll see what is going on in Argentina actually deepening, which is a widening of inequalities, in income concentration, but mostly in terms of overall opportunities for different population groups. And the usual suspects are the ones that keep on getting the lower hand in terms of women, in terms of particularly households with children, of particular regions, of lower sectors in the income distribution. So we can use this crisis to realize that if we don't put people at the core of our decisions in terms of policy, in terms of development, we won't end up solving the problems that need to be solved.
So the crisis can become a catalyst, you're saying. That's excellent. Mark, I would like to bring you in. You have published widely about social progress, equality of opportunity, economic fairness, and the economics of climate change. So how do you, as an academic, conceptualize the effects of this polycrisis that we're going through, the transformation on social well-being?
Yeah, I'm afraid that what Gala has described for Argentina holds more or less for the whole world. There is a combination of these different crises that you, Sebastian, listed, and indeed they have consequences on many dimensions of people's life and many factors of well-being. Let's start with health, for instance, the COVID crisis, but not just the COVID crisis, also social problems leading to deaths of despair in the US, for instance, and the resurgence of violence and conflict in many parts of the world are leading to a sort of spectacular decrease in life expectancy in many parts of the world. So that's one dimension. And health is not just physical health, there is also mental health. And here, mental health actually is considered to be one of the key determinants of well-being according to people themselves. There is a survey of global happiness that is run by the Ipsos company, and physical health and mental health are the first two leading factors that people list in their well-being dimensions. And here, regarding mental health, stress has been a considerable problem, and this has been especially highlighted in the latest Human Development Report because of uncertainty, because of all the violence. A lot of stress is happening. And this is also connected to the distrust that Gala was describing. There is a lot of stress because people don't think they can rely on institutions. They don't think they can rely on people around them. And this is very worrisome. If you have a look at the World Happiness Report, you get a slightly different picture. So this is focused on a different sort of data, which is about life satisfaction, as recorded by the Gallup World Poll. And here you see things which are much more stable than in other sorts of data. No big trend, except in some parts of the world, no big trend and no big bumps around the latest crisis. So draw your conclusions. You can wonder whether these data are reliable, whether they really capture what matters to people, but they do show some things happening in parts of the world. So there was a positive trend in Central and Eastern Europe before the war in Ukraine, also a little bit in East Asia. But there was a declining trend in South Asia and in parts of Latin America for the bottom 50% of the population in terms of life satisfaction. And the case of Sub-Saharan Africa is striking because there you could see an upward trend for the top 50% in terms of life satisfaction and a downward trend for the bottom 50%. And so what's particularly striking is the misery index, so the people who give a score to their life satisfaction that is less than 3. has been rising in some parts of the world. So South Asia, now you have a trend that leads about almost half of the people, 45% of the people, being below 3 in terms of life satisfaction. And you have something similar, but much more recent, in sub-Saharan Africa. So probably linked to the various crises that have hit the continent. These are staggering numbers. In most other parts of the world, these numbers, this misery index is more around 10, 15%. Now, a positive element that you find in this report is that you've had, especially perhaps due to the COVID crisis, an increase in acts of benevolence. So people declaring that they have been helping others more than they used to. But as Gala said, the distrust is really a very problematic phenomenon connected to polarization. And so all these aspects of mental and material well-being are all going in various directions. But I would say, except for the apparently stable Gallup World Poll, if you take a very broad picture, there are many worrisome trends.
Thank you. So the effects are global. Irene, I would like to turn to you, and your organization focuses on advancing economic progress of women. Mark mentioned the deaths of despair in the US. So what is your perspective from a rich country on these issues that we're discussing?
Women don't feel rich globally. And I'm so delighted that we are putting women at the center of this conversation. Before COVID, McKinsey said that 40% of global GDP, and I apologize for GDP being used as a measure, that's all we know right now, 40% of global GDP was due to women's economic activity. 40%, all right? That's enormous. Imagine if they had equal pay. Imagine if they had access to jobs that paid more. Imagine if they had funding quickly for their startups and for their scale-up enterprises. Imagine if they didn't have to be confined to part-time work because they have to integrate work with family responsibilities. Well, McKinsey imagined, and it comes to $28 trillion of potential revenue if women were fully integrated into the global economy. So here's a paradigm shift. Put women in the center of global solutions going forward. You cannot have economic recovery post-COVID, post-war, post any natural disaster without women. Who the hell do you think is going to somehow replicate the economy we had before and grow it? So we cannot have this kind of discussion without women front and center. So I'm delighted to be covering women. Okay, now, During COVID, workers became decoupled from the workplace. Everyone had to work remotely, right? And employers discovered you can be productive and work remotely. This was something women always wanted for their well-being, to be able to have flexible time that makes, family and work possible. Now, there's a flip side to this. Because, as Dennis, the other Dennis, mentioned, there's always a crack in the wall. Working remotely can also lead to isolation and marginalization. It can lead to mental health issues. Because it's been mentioned to me, this woman vice president said to me, I felt isolated working from home. Then I go to work, and I felt isolated because there's nobody there. So it's a quandary. I always say nothing is for free. So the other unintended consequence is the hollowing out of our cities. What do we do about the well-being of our cities when the workers aren't there anymore that provided foot traffic for all the small businesses that relied on workers being there? In my city, Washington, D.C., the mayor is asking President Biden, tell the government workers to go to work because the city, the tax revenues from real estate, from all of those small businesses that were thriving before is disappearing, and you need the tax base in order to keep the services going. So I just want us to think about the consequences of some of the transformational changes that is happening to the workplace. Workplace is now an inchoate word, and a lot of management is now trying to deal with what does that mean? How do I create connectivity when your workforce is dispersed? How do you measure performance? What are the new metrics that we need to develop? How do we manage better when, my workers I have never seen? So, it's this kind of transformation that seemed to, welcome, that women welcome, also has longer-term impact that is very consequential. The other thing I wanted to mention, we've been talking here a lot about AI, is the consequences of it in terms of women. Because Goldman Sachs says the 300 million jobs will likely become obsolete or disappear altogether because of AI. And repetitive jobs, administrative jobs, are the jobs women hold, and they're the ones that are first to go. So I'm probably running out of time, but I do want to talk about digital poverty, which I think women will be subject to, okay? We found out, even in Washington, D.C., that low-income families did not have connectivity in the internet. They couldn't afford what was needed so that their kids could get books through the internet. They didn't have laptops. So that's in Washington, D.C. Can you imagine in the South? Only, I think I saw a figure, 119 million women do not have internet access. Only 7% hold digital phones. This is something we need to think about because connectivity, given the fact that digitalization and automation is accelerating, we need women to have access to the new digital world that will dictate how they work. So I'm going to shut up now. Okay.
Thank you. So the digital divide is affecting women disproportionately. Thank you for that dimension, which I think adds to the discussion that we had. Achim, I'd like to bring you in as the head of the United Nations Development Program. You're sitting kind of at the core of global governance. How do you prioritize these issues? I mean, we've heard everything from lack of trust to the digital divide. What's your perspective?
Thank you, Sebastian, and very good to join a panel that, without having spoken to each other, we actually are taking very similar departure points. I was struck by Gala and Mark both beginning with this issue of trust, and I think this is something we really do need to focus on because the erosion of trust in our public institutions, in the development pathways that we have chosen over the last 50, 100 years, many people have found themselves less and less confident in the outcomes. So I think this erosion of trust is both a reflection of inequalities, of perhaps choices that no longer are appropriate for what we know about what comes next. And Mark, you mentioned the Human Development Report, the last one, Uncertain Times, Uncertain Lives, was certainly an attempt to capture this very deep sentiment of disengagement, of resentment, of loss of trust. And I think it is affecting the way we're also dealing with all the social dimensions of development. And it affects also the way we perceive the role of government. The Edelman Trust Barometer last year found that 66% of those interviewed across, I think it's 30 countries or so, felt that governments mislead them. And this brings me to the next three very brief points. I use them with 3 T's in front, which in part explain this, but also point to the solutions. One is this notion of trade-offs. So often in development, we have invoked the notion of a trade-off. Rapid economic growth, well, the price of is social inequality, then it was environmental damage. For decades, we have been entrapping societies in a discourse about development choices that ultimately made more and more people feel that they were left behind. And this is also one reason why in the 2030 Agenda, the SDGs, this notion of leaving no one behind has become such a central tenet in the way we think about development looking to the future. A second part is the transitions. Arina, you just spoke about digitalization. I think it is a fascinating area where, again, we are seeing both the extraordinary possibilities of technology. You spoke about women in the digital age and economy. On one side, there is an enormous risk, as you have said, to leave significant parts of the population behind, and women in particular, and girls also. On the other hand, we have also seen that in the domain of digital finance, we have hundreds of millions of women being able to join the international or the domestic financial system for the first time by being able to essentially bypass banks for whom the doors were closed over the last decades. No land titles, no proper credit record, no ability to borrow. Today, we have countries where women borrow money in the morning in order to buy their goods, sell them in the market, repay the loan in the evening, all done on a smartphone. There are extraordinary developments, but they don't happen without policy design and without investment. And I think this brings me to the fourth T, beyond the trade-offs and the transitions domain, which is taxation. It's a very interesting topic. We often forget that in many of these transitions, particularly when technology plays an enormous role, it's the ability of government to be able to create the digital public infrastructure or a transport infrastructure. And that's where we determine who is included, who is excluded. And inequality becomes an extremely important design variable here. And taxation is still the way in which governments and societies essentially are able to mobilize resources from those who can afford to pay taxes in order to invest them, in particular also in addressing inequality, unequal access. So here are three variables that I think are extremely important to learn from history, how policymaking, how a society sets priorities and can either enhance social well-being or diminish it. And just to end, the Human Development Report Index for the first time in over 30 years has gone backwards for 2 years in a row. So we are in a profoundly disrupted moment in history.
Right. Thank you very much, Achim. And Sanjeev, last not least, I would like to turn to you. Thank you for your patience so far. India currently holds the G20 presidency, and then you're also a chairman of PwC in India. So what do you think the G20 should focus on regarding these issues? And what do you think the role of the private sector is in that?
So before I start, if we had more time, I would have asked people to close their eyes and do this for me. But if you are, let's assume that you are a patriarch in any family, in any part of the world, or let's say you are the youngest boy and girl in a family in any part of the world, what are the 2 or 3 things which are most important to you? You're talking about future. The youngest man or boy is thinking, or girl is thinking what the future lies ahead. The patriarch is thinking, how many years do I have to live? People talk about family because they are the ones who embrace us all the time, and who enables whatever I wish to happen. It is Mother Earth, as we say it. So from that standpoint, the G20 theme that India has picked up is all about future, family, and of course the resources which come from Mother Earth. And I think that's the theme. And to me, I think that's a very pertinent theme because you talked about the polycrisis. You talked about while we're talking polycrisis, I think we should be now ready for crisis every 3 months. There is something which is hitting us all the time. So polycrisis is here to stay. And I think we need to figure out ways and means to live with it and embrace it. So when you talk about the role that we all need to play, do we need to really, we talked about technology, for instance, do we need to fear it or should we embrace it? And figure out what are the ways and means by which we can actually navigate and actually find more inclusion. We're talking about incomes, we're talking about top 10% of the people having 52% of the income. We're talking about the lowest 50% having some 8 or 9% of income, and the wealth would be even more disparate. Now, how do we use some of these things rather than think matters to fear as matters to enable us? So for instance, from an India standpoint, I think the whole India stack is, I think, a classical example where India has embraced technology to make sure that there is financial inclusion through the Jan Dhan program, which has been very, very successful, as also the biometrics, which is there through the Aadhaar program, where you can, and of course more recently the ability for us to actually have financial inclusion, whether it is opening bank accounts, getting insurance, and so on and so forth, through any of the mechanisms that have been done through the use of technology, and it is publicly owned. It is not in private hands, it is publicly owned. So to me, I think this is just one example of how technology needs to be embraced to find solutions to the problem as opposed to fearing them. I think that's the first point that I wanted to make. I think the second one that I wanted to really make is that we will always keep talking about, and I think Irene, you made the point, whether GDP is the right indicator and whether some other is the right indicator. See, I think we need to live with duality in mind. It is always going to be the case. We will never be able to mitigate a GDP issue or some other issue, etc. Whether it is the SDG goals and so on and so forth. I think all of that will be important, right? Coming from India, and we are in Berlin. 1989, the Berlin Wall went down. 1991, India started liberalizing its economy. By that time, people were already wondering whether globalization is good or not. Continued till 2010. Mm-hmm. And today we are talking about whether globalization is good or bad. I think some of these things are good to talk, but I think we need to embrace them and we need to work through them, as opposed to thinking that, okay, is this good enough now? Somebody else has monetized it for so many years. Look at yesterday. I was sitting here and we were talking about climate financing. On this table, there were no real answers about climate financing, while there have been so many commitments made in COPs all these years. I think that's the point, that we need to get down to execution of some of these things and make real, tangible offers as to this is my solution. It is for us, all of us, to keep sitting and saying that, okay, this is what we ought to do. Mm-hmm. The time is gone. This is what we are doing.
So embrace technology, find the right financing for the climate transition. Thank you very much. That's exactly my next question. Like, how do we address these issues effectively? And Gala, I would come back to you. Your organization, your think tank, focuses actually on policy advice. So what is the one policy that you would want to promote?
It's not actually a focus on policy, but a focus on process, on how to get to that policy, which is co-constructing without engaging different sectors, different populations.
It's more methodology.
Exactly. Yeah. To acknowledge that these problems that we are facing, every problem that we've mentioned this far, are complex problems. We need a very broad engagement of stakeholders. Not a think tank advising a government will be able to change this.
But how do you do that without trust?
Well, we need to agree on very concrete actions that can be done, concrete and feasible actions, given the restrictions of the moment, of the context, not only fiscally, but also in political terms, in technical terms, etc., to be able to showcase that some changes are possible with the agreement of different actors that should be involved in the implementations of those actions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mark, based on your research, what would you recommend? Like, if there's one policy that you could promote globally, what would it be?
Yeah, there is one element I would like to push forward, but before that, I think I should say that there are some basics that we shouldn't forget, because I don't want to sell one idea as the only idea. And now what has been happening in Ukraine, I think, has been a wake-up call for many Europeans, starting from peaceful institutions, no repression, trustworthy institutions, the rule of law, and democracy. These are the basics for promotion of well-being. And the second basic pillar is the existence of a safety net in various ways, but mostly through the welfare state. And this is a key element to remove an important source of stress. And that should include preparedness for pandemics and things like that. Mm-hmm. Now, and there are a few other things, of course. I could mention migration policy and women and minorities and all that. But the one idea I'd like to push, because it's not often mentioned, is the promotion of good jobs. Good jobs, so you mentioned the private sector earlier, Sebastian. Indeed, I think the private sector has an important role to play. We economists tend to think a lot about public policy, but there is a lot that can happen in corporate social responsibility. And so companies treating their human resources in a human way is a super important element that can not only promote well-being, because people spend most of their day at work, right? So it's an important part of what they experience in their life. But it's also part of a form of civic education. So people who are treated humanly with respect and who are able to be autonomous at work and participate in decisions affecting their working conditions, these people also tend to become good citizens. So there is a very, very important role for the private sector in this respect.
Irene, would you agree with that assessment that the private sector really is key to solve this?
Absolutely. You know, companies adopted green policies way before, you know, cities and towns, et cetera, or federal governments developed policies regarding carbon emissions. They are into climate change with targets, deadlines, et cetera, because they have seen supply chain disruptions. They have seen their workers' homes destroyed, their factories destroyed. So, yeah, if you don't bring private sector in, you can't just rely on government and policy makers, okay? Given what we discussed yesterday about 2-year and 4-year terms. Actually, in the US, and this is not to say that my country does everything right, we don't, absolutely not. When there were threats to the voting right of especially African Americans, and states started to pass laws that limit voter access, 100 CEOs took a page in the New York Times and signed on to say, voting is key to democracy and it cannot be limited. And so they said out loud what nobody else was saying. And taking positions now on policy has become something that's sort of, you know, private sector driven in my country. Me Too happened, and all of a sudden companies were reviewing their gender relations in the workplace. Sometimes it takes a crisis to make public and private sector respond, but we have to take resources where they are. If we don't have public-private sector partnership, global solutions ain't gonna happen, okay? And if women aren't central to that, it ain't gonna happen either. How about this as a paradigm shift? We keep talking about that. Engage women fulsomely in the economy of every economy in the world, I can guarantee you big time paradigm shift, because women don't take risks with other people's money and they are much more responsive to climate change initiatives than men.
Thank you, Irene. Achim, you mentioned taxation, and that kind of seems to be in a slight contradiction to the role of the public sector that's been promoted here. Do you see that as a contradiction, or is it what's the role of taxation? How much taxation do we need, and how do we find a taxation regime that doesn't stifle the private sector?
Well, look, first of all, I don't think there is a contradiction between a state which we essentially empower and task with creating the rules of the game, whether it's for the market or how we live with each other. And I think every country has its own pathway here. And just to remind ourselves, in the United States, the top band tax rate in the 1950s was close to 70%. How America funded the research and development, the infrastructure, the ability to train and educate people, to send, men at the time, I mean, sorry, it was men, but now women also into space. There is an extraordinary role that public policy plays, but not, anymore in this very polarized debate we had for much of the 80s, 90s. The state is either the solution to everything or the market is the solution to everything. We need to have both. And I think some of the most successful economies, whether it is on the issue of inequity, equitable access to services, whether it is on action on climate change, energy transitions, are precisely the countries where there is a strong consensus about setting the rules of the game, correcting also for the failures of the market, and then being able to move forward as a society. And I think this is why I want to you asked what is one area in which we need to think carefully. I think it is financing. There are countries such as India, Sanjeev just spoke about it, where there is an extraordinary expansion of renewable energy happening now. Government sent that signal into the market, 480,000 megawatts of renewable electricity infrastructure being added to the grid in the next 8 years, largely funded by private investors. In other countries, there is no private investment on which to draw. There we have to look at financing with an international community, but it's essentially public-private financing and how to send the right signals to remove distortions in the way that we favor fossil fuels and therefore make the transition more difficult. And at the same time, we also have to address finance in terms of the short-term shock we are in right now, which is a major debt crisis. And frankly, the private creditors are not coming to the table. Many developing countries are one step away from not being able to anymore honor their commitments, including paying interest rates. That is default territory for entire economies. Finance is a crucial part, and it has very much a public and a private sector and a market element. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sanjeev, you said that as well, that we need to talk about the finance side of things. But let me ask you, Dr. I mean, you're advising some of the largest companies in India. And how much taxation do you think is necessary? Do we tax big corporations enough, particularly on the global level, to achieve the objectives that we want to achieve?
Well, I think that can obviously be debated, but if you do something beyond a point, it can be counterproductive. I mean, you look at the way the tax rates are in some of the major parts of the world, and you look at the tax to GDP ratios where they are. Of course, in certain countries they could be higher. I mean, from talking about India, for instance, it's always a question. You need to balance the ability for you to encourage businesses to invest, which of course creates employment thereafter, and to be able to generate resources. So for India, for instance, just formalizing the economy through the introduction of the goods and service tax 5 years back has been a huge enabler. I think the goods and service tax in India has been growing 22% almost every year, which is creating more resources. And so much so that last year in the Indian budget, 30% incremental capital expenditure the government of India could afford because of this. So I think it is about how you tax, what you tax, and of course, what is the governance mechanism that you have around taxation, which are also very, very important.
Right.
The one point that I'd like to add to the point that was being made earlier, I think if you look at the private sector participation, I think they need to be also embraced a little bit in terms of encouragement that you provide to them to be able to do the right things. I mean, there are a lot of statistics which will tell you that the profits of the largest corporations can easily mitigate the poverty alleviation requirements that we have. But the question is, what is the trigger and how are they being embraced to do so? I think we need a trigger.
We need to give them incentives, whether it's tax-based incentives, but we have to sort of accelerate private sector engagement. They're already there. How can they be profitable if they don't pay attention to the wellness needs of their employees or the communities of which they're a part? I mean, it's sort of very basic. I wanted to mention that for women, work is a wellness issue. Having it is also as important as having access to family care. And that is something we need to remember. It's not that they're asking for, oh, help me. No. They're actually at the center of their own quest for income. I want women to have more money, but not here at the bottom. I want them to go up to the top. So that's how come there are already public policies embraced by numerous countries, quotas for women on boards in 42 countries now, quotas for women in senior management. Germany and France have it. Quotas to get women into the supply chain. That is available in South Africa. So let us use policies that are there already and speed them up, have them be adopted. You don't have to start from zero is what I'm saying.
So sometimes we need more than incentives, then we need actual regulation. So is that, Gala, what do you think from a perspective of Argentine?
I totally agree with Irene, and there's one aspect that I think is crucial to foster this better and larger participation of women, which I also think it's crucial, and it's the thing that would lead us to a paradigm change, which is care policies. Without acknowledging the relevance of care that is crucial for our reproduction as a species, for our survival, we won't be able to have a greater and a larger participation of women in the labor market. So we need to invest and to articulate all the relevant stakeholders to have a better organization of care and larger and better policies behind care work.
We have about 2-3 minutes. Sanjeev, do you agree with that assessment that we need better care policies?
No, absolutely. When I look at the broader ESG agenda as it currently stands in India, there's a lot of focus on climate. Governance has always been an issue, but the social elements are at times, not given as much weightage.
Yep.
So, currently we're even working with the regulators to say that there should be specific requirements on the S. And, when it comes to diversity, when it comes to inclusiveness, etc., I think those become very, very important. I mean, what is it that you're doing at the most granular level? I mean, what are you doing you pull out minerals from the earth, right, for your steel plants and so on and so forth. What are you doing for that community at large? I think that becomes very, very important. How are you giving employment to some of those people where you actually set up, those factories? I think that becomes very, very important.
Right.
And I think the one other thing which I would say is that I think that point was made about mental well-being, etc. I think that is something which we need to be overweight on, because the last 3 years have told us, whether you are in a services industry, whether you're in the manufacturing industry, that is becoming a big issue. And with people having missed 2 or 3 years of schooling, I think I've seen so many kids fall through, and I think that is very, very important. We need we need more focus on that.
So we need to keep more of the value creation actually in the countries of origin, as Chancellor Charles rightly said yesterday as well. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you so much for the discussion. I could keep asking and quizzing you all day. So thank you very much for your input. Thank you both online for your time. We have a short break for about a minute, and then the next panel is going to come up. Thank you.
Thank you.